were not buried, not yet, in the autumn frost of 1860, at the edge of Vermont's hollowed woods. 6 members of the Calder family lay down each night in coffins of their own making. The townsfolk believed it to be madness, but madness does not come with rules, and the Calders had rules: never sleep past dawn, never close the coffin fully, and never, under any circumstance, respond to the knock that comes from beneath the floorboards. The Calder farmhouse was old, built before the Civil War, before the valley had a name, but something older than the wood lived beneath its beams. It had whispered first to the mother, then the children, then the father, who stopped speaking altogether. They did not die. They rehearsed each night. They folded themselves into the dark like faithful mourners awaiting a Messiah made of bone. Each morning, they awoke as if disappointed, until one did not wake. Her coffin was empty, the lid closed, and the air inside still warm. The sheriff who investigated the home left before midnight. He would not say what he saw inside the nursery coffin. He simply walked into the woods and was never seen again. That no one visits the Calder house now. Its windows are lined with soot. Its cellar door is nailed shut from the outside. But sometimes, when the wind dips low, a knocking sound echoes up through the well, slow, deliberate, and counting, not the living, not the dead, something in between. You are listening to the withered ledger. Tonight's story is not one of death. It is one of devotion and the horror of waiting too long for something promised to rise. The Calder home stood on the edge of a valley that no longer had a name. Whatever it had once been called had fallen out of favor, as most things in that part of Vermont eventually did. It was the kind of place where snow came early, stayed late, and the trees leaned in too close, as if listening for something they were not meant to hear. The house itself was modest 2 stories, warped from age, its windows fogged not with weather, but with something older that clung to the glass. The wood groaned in windless nights, the chimney never smoked, even in winter, and the path to the door was always swept clean, despite no one ever seeing a hand do it. Inside lived the Calder family, 6 of them, though only 5 were ever seen. In daylight, Miriam, the mother, tall and pale, moved like someone who had been born inside the house and had never dared to leave it. Her eyes did not blink often, and her hair was always wrapped in a black cloth, even when no guests were expected. Elias, her husband, once ran the lumber mill before it shut down. Now, he only tended the firewood and stared through walls as if there were something on the other side calling him back. The children were quiet, always. There were 4, Thomas, the eldest at 16, who did not speak anymore, Grace, 14, who hummed lullabies with no known melody, Peter, 9, who had a limp no doctor could explain, and Naomi, 5, the youngest, the softest, the one whose eyes never adjusted to sunlight. They rarely came to town, and when they did, they came all together, in a covered wagon drawn by a single black mule. They never bought much: salt, kerosene, cloth, never sugar, never toys, and never candles. Candles could not be trusted to hold the dark back. Miriam once told the general store owner, the dark must be invited, not fought. Most believed the Calders had simply gone strange from grief. It was known, after all, that a child had been stillborn many winters ago, a 7th name that had never made it onto paper, a grave marked not with stone, but with a pile of twigs just behind the barn, always freshly arranged. Still, what set the Calder family apart was not their silence. It was where they slept, each night, without fail, at the final toll of the distant chapel bell. The Calders would descend into the cellar where 6 handcrafted wooden boxes awaited them. Coffins, not symbolic ones, not mere rituals, real coffins polished, fitted to each of them, lined with coarse wool. Carved from the planks of their own barn, each bore a name, etched not with tools, but burned in blackened script. Not one coffin had a lid fully sealed. They lay half open, as if waiting to be closed by something or someone on the outside. At sundown, the house fell into stillness. The oil lamps, set along the walls, were always turned inward toward the walls, not out into the room. Mirrors were covered. Fires were extinguished. Even the clock stopped ticking once the final family member had climbed inside their coffin. They called it the descent. Those who passed by the house at night, though few dared to do so, spoke of soft music drifting through the cracks in the floorboards, hymns, some said, but not like any sung in the church. These were slow, low, and carried backwards syllables that no tongue should be able to shape. The hymns never followed any known time signature. They rose and fell like breathing. Some nights, it almost sounded as if the house itself were singing. The oldest surviving account came from a mail carrier who once delivered a parcel to their doorstep at dusk. He claimed he heard 6 distinct voices chanting from the ground beneath the porch. One voice, small, breathy, sounded as if it were answering the others from deeper down, where no cellar should reach. The parcel was never picked up for months. This ritual continued in eerie repetition until Naomi broke it. It was the first true winter storm of that year, the kind that buries fence posts and silences the wind. Even the wolves stayed low. In the Calder house, the descent had already begun. Elias was the last to lower himself into his coffin that night, as he always did. He was the only one who lingered near the cellar door, perhaps listening, perhaps guarding. But when morning came, what passed for morning beneath the overcast snow sky, Miriam noticed Naomi's coffin was not only open, it was empty. At first, she thought the child had risen early, but her blankets were untouched, and the lid had been pulled as far shut as Naomi's small arms could manage. She searched the cellar, the attic, every corner of the house where a child might hide. Nothing. Then she heard a soft, rhythmic thudding upstairs. She climbed the steps slowly, each one creaking in protest. The hallway smelled of old wool and pine smoke. The nursery door, long unused, was ajar. Inside, curled on the floor in her nightgown, lay Naomi. Her skin was cold, her eyes open, but not seeing. Her lips moved in silent formation, as if reciting a verse from memory. It took Miriam hours to bring her back into full awareness, not with words, but with warm broth and the brushing of her hair, methods used by mothers long before medicine had a name. That night, Naomi refused to enter her coffin. She clung to the floorboards instead, whispering through her sobs, "They were calling me," she cried. From under the wood, under the house, they were knocking. I counted 6, then one more. Miriam did not speak. She carried Naomi into her arms, cradled her beside the fireplace, and stared at the cellar door. It remained closed, but the silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. As if the house were holding its breath. The next morning, snow blocked every path out of the valley. The well froze solid. The mule was found dead, its eyes missing, though there were no tracks in the snow. And in the barn, beside the pile of arranged twigs, a 7th coffin had appeared, smaller than the rest, lined in black wool. No name, but carved across the side, deep and angry, were 3 words: "She is ready." Long before the Calder family began sleeping in coffins, the house had already learned how to hold grief. It was 13 winters ago when Miriam gave birth to a child that never cried. A girl, full term, beautiful, but silent. Elias had built the cradle himself weeks before the snow came. White wood, smoothed edges, painted with milk and rosewater. But the cradle stayed empty. The baby did not move, not even once, or so the midwife believed. Miriam, however, remembered something different. It happened just after the midwife stepped outside to boil water. Miriam was alone in the room, still bleeding, barely conscious. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the child's face. She could swear she saw the baby's lips part. Just a little, just enough, like the first gasp of breath at the bottom of a frozen lake, like someone trying to wake up through layers of ice. The moment passed, and Miriam never spoke of it. They buried the baby behind the barn. No name was given, only a bundle, wrapped in linen, placed beneath a pile of twigs. The snow covered it that night, and Miriam stopped speaking for days. The neighbors said it was grief, but grief fades. What grew in its place was not sorrow, it was certainty. A year passed, and then a preacher came to town. He was not from Vermont. His accent was strange, flat, slow, with syllables that lingered too long. No one remembered inviting him. No one knew which direction he came from, but he arrived with nothing but a walking stick, a dark coat, and a book wrapped in twine. He spoke in the town square on a Sunday afternoon. After church had let out, the townsfolk listened, half out of curiosity, half out of boredom. But Miriam stood still through the entire sermon. He spoke not of heaven or sin, but of the sleep between worlds, a waiting place. He said, between breath and bone, a space where souls could drift, unfinished, if they were not prepared. He called it the rehearsal chamber, and he said the living could train themselves to reach it. Lay in the shape of death, he said, and death will mistake you for one of its own. Do it enough times, and you might learn how to return. Miriam did not blink. She invited him to supper that evening. He never returned to town after that. That spring, Elias stopped working at the mill. The family became quiet, withdrawn, and the first coffin was built not for burial, but for rest. It was Miriam's idea. She claimed it brought peace. She said the child's breath, the one she remembered in the dark, was not a dream. She believed the soul had tried to return but found no body waiting. Now, she would be ready. So would her children. The Calder home changed after that. At first, it was subtle. They stopped eating dinner at the table. Plates were brought to the floor instead, eaten in silence. No salt, no meat, no wine, only roots, boiled barley, and cold well water. They called this the emptying. Then came the descent. Each evening, after dusk, the family would enter the cellar. 6 coffins were arranged in a wide circle on the stone floor. They would lay inside not to sleep, but to practice stillness. Elias timed them with an old pocket watch. They stayed inside for 1 hour, then 2. By autumn, they no longer came up at all until dawn. When neighbors asked why the children were no longer seen outside, Miriam simply said, "They are learning to listen." It was not until the following year that things grew stranger. One neighbor, Ezra Bell, was walking past the Calder land near sundown. He had taken a longer route home after hunting rabbits, and the snow was just beginning to fall. He noticed something out in the tree line. Not graves, not holes. The Calder children, Thomas and Grace, were kneeling at the base of an old maple, carving something into its roots with dull knives. They did not look up when he passed. Ezra called out to them. No answer. What chilled him most, he later said, was not the silence. It was the sound of whispering. Though neither of their mouths moved, he quickened his pace. He told the sheriff the next morning, but by then, the snow had covered any sign of the symbols, and the sheriff did not press further. No one liked being near the Calder place too long. Weeks passed. The air grew heavier. Even the birds stopped flying over the valley. And then it happened. One of the children, Grace, was gone. It was Elias who discovered it. At dawn, he opened the cellar door as usual, preparing to lift the lids one by one. But when he reached Grace's coffin, it was already closed, sealed tightly, not nailed, not locked, sealed in a way that the wood seemed to grow into itself. No seams, no handles. He called for Miriam. She came quickly, but did not cry. She only placed her hand on the wood, leaned close, and whispered something, a word not heard before, a name, maybe. Then she turned and walked upstairs. No one called the sheriff. By evening, Grace's name was no longer spoken. Her plate was removed from the floor. Her chair disappeared from the kitchen. And the next morning, a new coffin appeared beside the others, slightly larger, deeper. It had no name, but inside it, beneath a folded cloth, lay a worn ribbon, one that Grace had always tied around her hair. Naomi, the youngest, began crying in her sleep. She would whisper to herself after dusk, even while inside her coffin, "Do not knock," she said. "Do not answer." Elias began walking the cellar at night, his boots dragging slowly across the stone floor. He held the preacher's book in his hand. It was no longer wrapped in twine. The pages were marked, some torn, others written in strange ink red, wet-smelling, still fresh. Miriam no longer left the house. She spent her days sitting beside the fireplace, facing the cellar door, as if waiting for a voice to come through it. Then came the first snowstorm of winter. It covered the roof in a single hour. The trail to town vanished. The mule had not been replaced since the last one died. They were alone now, completely. That night, the descent was quieter than usual. No hymns, no breathing, only the sound of The wind outside and the creaking of wood inside like boards shifting beneath weight. At sunrise, Thomas the eldest did not rise. His coffin was open, but he was not there. Instead, inside the box, where his body should have been, lay only his shoes and a single pinnacone, still green, still fresh, as if plucked from a living tree. But no tree in Vermont stays green in winter. By noon, Miriam called for Naomi to come sit beside her. She pulled the child close and stroked her hair. She whispered, "The sleep must be full now. The time is near. Your breath must slow." Naomi asked where her brother went. Miriam only smiled. "He is ahead of us, that is all." That evening, Elias lit a lantern in the root cellar. He drew the children, those who remained, into a circle. He opened the book one last time, and he began to pray in a tongue that sounded nothing like scripture. There's a sound older than language. It is not loud. It does not echo. It does not knock to be heard. It knocks to be known. And in the Calder household, it had begun calling them by name. It was the neighbor boy who first told the sheriff what he saw before he stopped speaking altogether. His name was Jonas Meyer, 13 years old. Red hair, quick hands, sharp eyes. He lived 2 farms over and dared the other boys to run up the Calder porch at dusk and knock. Most never did. Jonas went further. He crossed the threshold. The door was not locked. Inside, the house smelled of iron and wet earth. The boy followed the sound, low chanting, like bees humming in reverse, to the cellar door, cracked open. Candlelight flickered below. Jonas crept down. He found the family not asleep in their coffins, but gathered in a circle round an open pit, carved into the earth beneath the foundation. The hole was wide enough for a man to descend. Its edges were rimmed with chalk and salt, though both had been scattered, as if something from below had pushed back. Elias knelt closest to it, murmuring. His face looked thinner than any photograph had ever shown. His eyes had sunk into hollows, like they were trying to retreat from what they had seen. He was listening, and then, speaking back, Jonas watched Elias place his ear to the ground and whisper, "Naomi." A pause. "Naomi, is it you?" A long silence. Then, Elias smiled, but it was the smile of a man who has recognized something and knows he will never unsee it. Jonas backed up the stairs and ran, but before he reached the road, he heard it, the knock. Not loud, not on wood, on earth, 3 short, 1 long. Thump, 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 thump. When he told his parents what he had seen, his mother made the sign of the cross. His father packed the wagon to leave town. They never spoke of Jonas again at the Calder house. The cellar became a second chapel. The children no longer spoke at all during daylight hours. They sat with blank eyes at the dinner table, their forks untouched, except for Ruth, the 3rd child, who would only sip water fetched from the old stone well in back. She drank slowly, reverently, as if the water carried something more than memory. Miriam's face was changing. It began with the color of her skin, an unnatural gray, like something spoiled just beneath the surface. Then her fingernails, they darkened to coal, hardened, curved like claws. Her eyes no longer blinked regularly, and when she looked at the children, she did not always seem to recognize them. But they recognized her. They followed her down into the cellar each evening, one by one, in white nightgowns, holding candles they did not light. They stood in silence as Elias traced the edge of the pit with ash and bone dust. They waited for the knock. They prayed for it. It was not long before the knock changed. At first, it had been random, curious, like something pressing gently against the wall of a dream. But then it found rhythm. Then it found names. Elias began to whisper them aloud during meals, during walks to the barn, during sleep. Naomi's name first, then Ruth, then Daniel, and one morning, the Calders awoke to find Ruth's coffin shut from within. No scream, no thud, no broken latch, just silence, and the lid sealed with the same gray ash they had seen ring the cellar pit. When Elias pried it open, it was empty. Only her nightgown remained, folded neatly on the pillow, her water cup still half full, on the windowsill, and a single black nail, curved like her mother's. Word spread. It always does, even in places where people do not want to speak. The hymns, some said, were no longer in Latin or English. They were something else now, something deeper. Some old tongue, curled in the back of the throat like a serpent. The older folks, those who remembered scraps of Gaelic or Alsatian prayers, shook their heads. It is older than that. The townsfolk begged the new preacher to go. He was young, brave, devout. His name was Thomas Alwyn. He had never married, spoke softly, believed deeply. He went alone. He knocked. The door opened by itself. No one saw him again. Only his Bible returned, pages soaked, not in water, but in a thick, black fluid that never dried. The spine had been cracked backward, as if forced open by something that did not want it shut. The Calder home changed. Windows were no longer boarded, but the glass grew darker from the inside, as if breath had fogged them. Permanently, the roof sagged, even though no rain had fallen. The trees grew away from the property line, bending, like they too feared being too close. Most telling of all, the coffins began closing themselves, one by one, each night, with no hands near them. Elias would stand in the hallway and watch, jaw trembling. The lids would creak shut in perfect rhythm. First Daniel's, then Naomi's, then the twin coffins, empty now but still honored. For the children who had vanished, he no longer sealed them with nails, no longer prayed over them. He just watched and waited, listening for the knock. Then, something else happened. Jonas, the boy who had entered the house, was seen again, but not how they remembered him. He stood near the edge of the Calder property one foggy morning, staring at the barn. His skin looked pale, too pale, like the color had been wrung from his blood. His eyes wrong, like glass marbles left too long in smoke. When someone called to him, he did not speak. He simply smiled, then turned, then walked straight into the mist, vanishing between the trees like he had never existed at all. There are places in this world where belief becomes architecture, where ideas dig into the earth and sprout roots that no man can pull free. The Calder house was no longer just wood and stone. It was becoming something else, a vessel, a door, a rehearsal space for the dead. And what waited beneath had begun knocking back. You are listening to the withered ledger. The Calders were not mad. They were methodical, and as you will hear in the final chapter, there are some awakenings that require practice and sacrifice, because death is not a curtain. It is a script, and someone, something, is always listening from the audience below. The last day anyone saw the Calder family was a Tuesday. Snow had begun to fall again, heavier than it had in weeks. The road into the valley had vanished under layers of white silence. The only tracks were from crows, circling, watching. The postman never reached the Calder property. He said the winds whispered things not meant for ears, that he felt the trees leaned too close when he passed the wooden gate, that the hills had grown eyes. It was not until 3 weeks later that anyone dared to enter the Calder house. Deputy Harlan, Myers and 2 townsmen from neighboring Auburn Hill braved the valley, carrying with them axes, lanterns, and scripture. What they found was not rot or ruin, but stillness. The house stood tall, unmoved by the winter. The door was closed, but not locked. The windows were not broken, yet not a single reflection looked back. Inside, silence. No signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Even the candles were burnt down precisely, as if snuffed at the same hour. The air held no stench, and yet a thick dread clung to the walls, as if the room itself had learned to breathe in intervals. Then they found the coffins, not in the parlor, not hidden, but displayed in a perfect circle across the living room floor. 6 in total, grown shut, not nailed. The wood had fused together at the seams, curling like bark over old wounds. The men tried to pry one open, but the wood bled sap, warm and pulsing, as if alive. Deputy Myers said they should leave, but the others insisted there could still be someone alive, so they broke through the floorboards. In the cellar, they found remnants of symbols carved into the earth, now overgrown with black mold, as if the house had tried to heal them shut. And in the center, the journal, bound in calfskin, marked with dried petals and what looked like drops of iron. It was Miriam Calder's hand. The final page read, "We did not fear death. We feared being forgotten by what lies below. Tonight, we earn its memory each coffin was later opened under the supervision of the sheriff and a reverend. What they found sent the town into decades of silence. Each Calder lay inside, unmarked. Their skin bore no wounds, no decay. Their eyes were closed, their lips curled and soft. Serene smiles, not the frozen mask of rigor mortis, but the kind of smile one wears when hearing a long-lost lullaby. Naomi's hands were folded neatly across her chest. Her fingernails were dark with soil. David, the eldest son, had his fingers pressed to his ears, as if still listening for silence. Lydia's coffin contained a ring of carved roots around her neck, braided carefully like a garland. Elias held a book with no words, and Miriam, her skin was pale but not cold. Her eyes had wept something black that dried like ink, but her face glowed, as though she had seen something on the other side, and welcomed it. All 6 were buried at the town's edge in unmarked graves, per the family's request from years prior, but that was not the end. Years later, in 1910, the property was purchased by a man named Franklin Jameson, a Boston investor seeking solitude. He had no family, no knowledge of the Calder name. He tore down what remained of the house and began construction on a farmhouse of his own. But his builders refused to break ground near the old root cellar, so Franklin moved the well to the far end of the property. On the 10th day of digging, they found the stone seal, buried beneath layers of clay and frostbitten soil, a ring of granite slabs, etched with markings no one could read. One slab bore the shape of an eye, hollowed out in the center. They dug deeper. The chamber was carved straight into the earth, as if the ground had parted willingly. It was colder than the air above, yet no frost touched the walls. The space smelled of cedar and oil. Inside were 6 empty coffins. Each matched the size and grain of the ones the Calders had once slept in. But they were open, not cracked, not broken. Opened, as if used, then vacated. At the far end of the chamber was a 7th coffin. Smaller, tightly shut. It bore no handles, no seams, no dust. It looked as though it had grown there, like a root. In the stone, Franklin placed his ear against the wood and heard scratching. He sealed the chamber, paid the workers, sold the land. The new buyers built a barn over it. It burned down within the year. The Legacyth town no longer speaks of the Calder family, not out of fear, but reverence, as though their story touched something ancient that ought not be disturbed. Visitors sometimes say the valley feels thinner. That sound behaves strangely near the old orchard. That animals avoid the area. That the snow never melts right there, even in the spring. Children, in dares and whispers, say if you lie in a coffin at dusk with your eyes closed and say the name Miriam 3 times, you will hear a voice from under the floor. One that does not ask questions. One that already knows your name. And still, the journal remains locked in a sealed vault in the town's chapel archives. Its final line, smudged but legible, was likely written in the last hour of Miriam's life, or what came after. We rehearsed it not to escape death, but to welcome what remembered us, and now it remembers still.